Welcome to Part 2, Using Simulation in Leadership Courses, Providing a Means for Application of Core Concepts. Part 2 will discuss development of the leadership simulation exercise. The making of a leadership simulation exercise. We'll start with the assembly of the faculty facilitators and case selection, then script production, moving onward to logistics, resources, implementation, and then finally student evaluation and faculty debrief. Assemble faculty facilitators. As Dr. Rogers mentioned in Part 1, choosing scenario topics is the first challenge in developing the leadership simulation exercises. Leadership course coordinators provided a list of potential topics, which were identified using the methods described in Part 1 of this module. A final list is selected by the faculty facilitators based on the number of scenarios that can be accommodated by the simulation schedule and faculty facilitators available. Assignment of the scenarios is based on facilitator preference and area of expertise. When scenario topics have been assigned, the next step is developing the scenario scripts and preparing for the simulation exercises. As facilitators developed their materials, sharing and feedback was highly valuable. We used a tool called Google Docs as well as email to share tools and discuss information. Early in the planning stages, generally during the first meeting, faculty facilitators decide on a timeline for development of the materials and the date of the exercise. Script production. The scenario script is a document that provides the setting, dialogue, and acting prompts for the actors. The setting is a description of the background, environment, and any other relevant information about the scene. In other words, the setting sets the scene for the scenario. In our pilot of leadership simulations, the scenario actors were given actual names like Betty, Sue, and Dr. A. But we found that using lifelike names was confusing. So for the following simulation days, we changed the script to basic names like charge nurse, bedside nurse, nearby nurse, and found that this was much less confusing to both actors and observers. Color coding each actor's lines on the script was also found to be very effective, since the students were able to quickly see their role, follow the dialogue, and know when to read their part. In addition to the setting and dialogue, include prompts for acting such as pretend to be angry, use loud voice, have an aggressive posture. Even though they are aware this is a simulation, students tend to be a bit shy about acting inappropriate, so having these things written for them is very helpful. Since the faculty facilitators vary by semester, and it's important that information is consistent, fact sheets for the faculty facilitator should accompany each scenario. Information about the case, questions, and correct answers, as well as hints for guiding the student debriefing should be included. The sample script and faculty facilitator fact sheet is provided for you in the resources section of this module. Logistics. Schedule and matrix creation is dependent on how much time you've determined that each scenario will require. For the sample scenarios provided in this module, each 1-hour session can include 2 scenarios. Each scenario should last only 15 minutes, with 10 minutes for debriefing. 2 scenarios per session equates to a 50-minute session for each rotation, allowing 10 minutes for students to travel to the next session and have a brief respite in between. Since there's time included in between sessions, no official break is added in the sample matrix. When reserving rooms, take into consideration that each room should be large enough to accommodate the actors and for observers to be far enough away to see the entire scenario. Some scenarios may require more space than others, so it's important to reserve rooms well in advance of the scheduled date of the exercise. Equipment reservation and preparation is determined by the type of scenario assigned to each room. Students were notified by email and in class to sign up for a group or register. A sign-up sheet with dates and times was posted in convenient areas for students. For our simulation exercises, students who did not sign up or register during the designated time frame were randomly assigned to a group. There are sample matrix templates and sign-up sheets for you in the resources section of this module. Resources: items to reserve or develop. The type of room reserved is determined by the characteristics of the scenario. For instance, a conference room is probably adequate if the scenario does not require a mannequin. Scenario resource kits are prepared prior to the implementation date and given to the faculty facilitator in order to prepare for their role. The scenario resource kits we used was a 3-ring notebook with plastic pocket pages, but you could use a small box or other container. The kit should contain name tags, script, faculty fact sheet, supplies such as pictures, small items like syringes or bottles, medical record forms, evaluation forms, and if you're taking pictures, consent for photo. And faculty should also plan to arrive well before the start of the session in order to assemble any equipment needed for the scenario. Resources: scenario equipment selection, high-tech versus low-tech. Scenario content determines the type of equipment that will be required for the simulation. I'd like to take a moment to briefly review some terminology. High fidelity includes use of realistic materials and equipment, whereas low fidelity uses materials and equipment that is less similar to what is used in real situations. An example of high-tech is an automated simulation mannequin or electrical equipment. Low-tech might include items such as syringes, bandages, or medication vials. With leadership scenarios, it's less likely that high-tech equipment such as automated simulation mannequins would be required, but they could be used for certain scenario topics. For example, in a 2-challenge rule lateral violence scenario, a patient was decompensated while nurses argued about a medication order. Initially, a high-tech mannequin was used for the patient in this scenario. However, we found that using a very realistic mannequin was not really needed. So the following day, the mannequin was not used, and instead, a detailed description of the patient's condition was given, along with pictures of the patient. The students were equally engaged in the case, and there was no difference in the students' learning outcomes. Implementation. Before you begin the simulation scenario with your students, review some ground rules for the session. Share the objectives for the exercise, give them the start, stop, and debrief times for the exercise, and because some students experience stress, mostly due to fear of judgment from both faculty and peers, it's important to establish a supportive climate for the beginning of the exercise. Describe the parameters for how the scenario will be implemented. Be sure to emphasize that the actors are reading a script and will be prompted to act inappropriately while in character. Another important ground rule to bring forward is confidentiality. Students should keep the scenario and discussions confidential so that each session is a fresh experience for each group. Students should not discuss the scenario outside the room until after all sessions are complete. Also include a rule for participation. Everyone should participate in the experience without fear of having a wrong answer. In most cases, students have fun with the scenario, and have really seemed to enjoy the acting and discussions. Orient the group to any equipment functionality and any setting simulations that are not obvious, such as this table is considered the patient bed. Also include a reminder about safety with any equipment of concern, such as sharp instruments. Actor selection. Allow students to volunteer to be actors. We have found that after they understand that there will be no judgment for their ability to act, and that all they have to do is read the script, students readily volunteer. Observer instructions. The ones who are not actors will be the observers, so those that don't volunteer get to be observers. Observers should be instructed to watch closely, identify the quality and safety concerns in the scenario, and begin to think about what actions the nurse leader might need to take. These observations are to be shared in the debriefing discussion. Explain that during the scenario, they should not interrupt the scene. There will be time for debriefing after the scenario is complete. Implementation. Actor preparation. It's important to have a short meeting with the student actors who will be reading the script prior to starting. Have the observers step outside the room for a few moments and be sure to tell them not to leave the area. While the observers are outside the room, describe the scenario and allow a moment for them to read the script. After they've read the script, have them to select the character they would like to play. In our experience, if there's a physician character, the facilitator plays that role so that the student's focus is on the nursing aspect of the scenario. Then, after they have selected their character and obtained their name tags, prompt the actors about acting out specific behaviors in the script. The facilitator should be prepared to provide reassurance for those who seem nervous about inappropriate actions contained in the script. This process generally takes no more than a few minutes. Implementation, the scenario. Each scenario should have a faculty facilitator sheet and should be reviewed by the facilitator prior to the exercise. This fact sheet is a reference tool. It contains detailed information about the scenario, objectives, and provides suggested questions with answers for the debriefing discussion. Providing this information helps to refresh the facilitator's knowledge about the subject matter and serves as a guide for the discussion. Since some scenarios may use equipment such as syringes or other potentially unsafe equipment, the facilitator must be observant at all times to maintain student safety. For example, one scenario involves an actor waving a syringe over a patient, as actors may become so involved in the scene that they may accidentally point the syringe at another actor. In this situation, actors are advised to keep the cap on the syringe and maintain distance from other actors. However, the facilitator must be vigilant to position actors so that there is no risk for injury. You'll notice in the picture on the slide the facilitator, in the lab coat, is watching very closely as the student actor holds the syringe. There's a sample faculty fact sheet provided in the resources section of this module. Implementation, debriefing. Debriefing is a delicate balance between allowing the students to express their opinions and ensuring that the key issues are discussed. The facilitator should guide the discussion by asking questions when the student discussion presents the opportunity to bring a key issue forward. And since the facilitator has established a climate of trust at the beginning of the exercise, students should be able to share their observations and opinions in an open and honest manner. However, we must remember that it's the facilitator's responsibility to protect the students from any comments that might influence their sense of self-worth in a negative manner. To summarize, the debriefing should cover an overview of what happened, what were the appropriate actions, reflection on what actions the nurse leader would or should take, and what did they learn from this scenario? Some generalized sample questions are: what issues were identified in the scenario? What actions the nurses in the scenario should have taken? As a nurse leader, what would you do in this situation? What knowledge, skills, and attitudes were learned in this exercise? Student evaluations. At the end of this exercise, each student completes a brief evaluation of the session. Questions are Likert style and open-ended questions. For each rotation, evaluations were color-coded for ease of collation. Further discussion of the pilot data will be discussed in Part 3 of this module. A copy of the simulation evaluation tool is provided in the resources section of this module. Faculty Facilitator Debrief. A Faculty Facilitator debriefing session should be scheduled as soon as possible after the simulation exercise is completed. There should be one person designated to take notes during the debriefing. Some suggested topics for the debriefing discussion are: overall process, such as rotation timing, room accommodations, adequacy of planning, what went well, what did not. Student experiences, were the students engaged in the scenario? Were there any exceptional experiences? Were there any issues that needed to be addressed? Learning outcomes, were they met and to what extent? Equipment and materials, did you have everything you needed? Evaluation review, take a moment to review the evaluations and discuss the results. Recommendation for changes, based on the discussion, what changes are recommended for the next time? Now, please proceed to Part 3 for a discussion of the evaluation process and data collection.